Your beliefs drive your actions. That is just a law of human nature. And in fact, on Tuesday, that law is going to be demonstrated en masse. See, there's a group of Americans that believe that our country is being overrun by bad immigrants who threaten our way of life. They are going to vote one way. And then there's another group of Americans who believe that body autonomy and reproductive rights are under attack. They will vote another way. See, your beliefs drive your actions. Don't believe me? Have you ever been upset with your spouse or your parents over something they did or something you did? Now, the next time you see them, then you're short-tempered and you're dismissive, even maybe a little mean. Your beliefs about them drove your actions toward them. It's true in relationships and it's true in religion. And that's why what you believe about God is so important. And that's why we've included it in our new mission statement. Now we're back to our series, RiverLife 2034, where we examine what RiverLife needs to be and do in order to be thriving and spiritually engaging and effective with the third and fourth generation Hmong 10 years from now. That's 2034. So a couple of weeks ago, we introduced a new mission statement. And we believe this mission statement will carry us into the future for the next decade or so. It's this: we are a next-gen Hmong church experiencing God together. Now, the first part says that we are a next-gen Hmong church. That means that we will always be looking ahead to our kids and our youth about how we can best understand them, create space for them, and nurture faith in them. Now, the second half of the mission, it lists out 3 core components. We are experiencing God together. This represents a holistic faith that is at the same time experiential, theological, and communal. So 2 weeks ago, before Halloween, Pastor Kong taught us the importance of the experiential side of faith. You see, most of us live off secondhand faith. A singer's worship songs, a pastor's sermons, your spouse's faith, or your family's Christian heritage. See, those are lesser secondhand experiences that rarely result in life change. But when you experience God firsthand, it changes you. That's why spiritual experiences are so important. Now, this week, I want to talk about the next word in the mission statement, is God. We are a next-gen Hmong church experiencing God together. See, this represents the theological side of faith. Now, the word theology can elicit a variety of reactions. I don't know how you're feeling about it right now when I say the word theology. But generally, people fall into one of 2 camps. They either tend to dismiss it as unimportant or to their daily lives, or they tend to overemphasize it even to the point of imbalance. Dismiss it or overemphasize it. Now, you might feel like theology is overly academic, it's complicated or even irrelevant to daily life. Now, just leave that to the pastors and the academics. All you need is faith in Jesus and a good cup of coffee. Now, unfortunately, this often leads to a shallow or an unstable faith. You see, without a foundation of sound doctrine, it can leave you vulnerable to misunderstandings about God, misinterpreting Scripture, and even falling for false teachings and false practices. Now, on the other hand, Some Christians place an excessive emphasis on theology, viewing it as the most important way of faith. Sermons can become saturated with big words and complex ideas. Now, this orientation can often lead to pride or a judgmental spirit. It can also turn the gospel into an intellectual exercise rather than a lived experience. So where are you on this spectrum? From underemphasize to overemphasize, unimportant to excessively important. Where are you along here? And so more importantly, how do you have a balanced view of theology? Regardless of which side you're on, how do you have a more balanced view of theology, seeing it as a tool more than a goal? Now, how can we lean into theology to clarify our understanding of God, to filter our experiences, to strengthen our faith, and even guide us to loving others well? Well, the answer to that can be found in Paul's pastoral epistles. These are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're written by the Apostle Paul to his apprentices, Timothy and Titus, as ways of instructing them on how to pastor a church. That's why they're called the pastoral epistles. Now, a major theme in these books is the importance of sound doctrine or instruction. It's actually the same word in Greek, doctrine and instruction. And in fact, it occurs 15 times in 13 chapters across all 3 of these books. That's more than once a chapter. It's all over the place. Now, today we're going to look at 2 passages from 1 Timothy. And these 2 passages balance our natural tendency to either underemphasize or overemphasize theology. And in fact, they act as a checks and balances to one another. And so each of you needs to hear one of these. All of us need to hear both, but you probably need to hear one of these more than the other. So let's start with a remedy for those of you who tend to dismiss or undervalue theology. Now, it's found in 1 Timothy 1, 3-11, okay, where Paul argues what I said earlier in the sermon, that your beliefs drive your actions. Now, when it comes to God, right theology leads to godly living, and wrong theology leads to sinful living. Let's read the passage. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. The goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and sincere faith. Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for the slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me. So this passage contrasts the real life results of false doctrine in verse 3, you can think of that as bad theology, versus sound doctrine in verse 10, think of that as good theology. And you can follow along in your bulletin. The whole passage is right there. So we're contrasting verse 10 to verse 11. And in your bulletin, The bad theology stuff is in red, and the good theology stuff is in green. So, Paul identifies two areas where false teaching or bad theology directly influences behaviors. First, confusion and falsehoods. He mentions things like myths, genealogies, and meaningless talk. The modern equivalent of this would be Christians obsessed with conspiracy theories, climate denials, anti-vaxxers, secret societies, and end-time predictions. The second thing that this passage talks about, in addition to confusion and falsehood, is moral compromise. Paul goes through a laundry list of sinful behaviors, including rebellion against God, violence, sexual immorality, dishonesty, and more. And according to him, good theology can protect you from those things. See, Paul argues that when you're not grounded in God's truth, you can be easily led astray into confusion and moral drift. Now, in contrast, he makes two profound statements. These are also in green. Verse 5, the goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. And then verse 11, sound doctrine conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God. So why does good theology matter? It keeps you rooted in God's truth. It guards you against confusion and moral compromise. And it directs you toward love, purity, and sincerity. So if you tend to undervalue or dismiss theology or just ignore it, you need to remember that your beliefs drive your actions. Sound doctrine leads to an accurate view of God, which then in turn leads to godly character. Meanwhile, weak theology leads to a shallow faith and even a wrong view of God. And this leaves you open to sin, deception, and lies. Now, let's look at the other side. A couple chapters later, Paul gives a remedy for those who tend to overemphasize theology, even to the point of imbalance. See, maybe this is you, and maybe you love big theology words and oversized systematic theology textbooks and profound complex sermons. Well, for you, let's read 1 Timothy 3:14-16. Although I hope to come to you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. Beyond all question, the mystery from which true godliness springs is great. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by the angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, and was taken up in glory. These few verses provide three safeguards against turning theology into an intellectual or an individualistic exercise, or as the pinnacle of faith. So first, theology is meant to guide behavior within the church, not just accumulate knowledge. Paul says right there in verse 15 that everything he is writing is aimed at guiding how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household. That's the church. Theology serves as a foundation, not for intellectual pride or knowledge, but for godly conduct within the church community. Theology used properly should strengthen relationships, promote unity, and serve the community, rather than create division or hierarchy based on who knows how much. Number two, the second thing that Paul says here, Jesus is ultimately a mystery beyond our full understanding. Jesus is a mystery beyond our full understanding. See, the problem with an intellectualized, systematic approach to theology is that the implicit belief behind it is that everything can be explained, ordered, and categorized. But this passage reminds us that Jesus Christ is a profound mystery. By describing Jesus this way, Paul invites us to approach theology with reverence, with humility, with worship, and an awe. Theology should not result in more firm confidence in knowing everything. It should result in more wonder, awe, and mystery. Because the more we know about Jesus and the more we know God, the more we see that there is so much more to know. Third, the core of our faith is simple, and it's centered on Christ's life, death, resurrection, and exaltation. The core of the Christian life is simple. It should not be complex. Verse 16 is incredible. Let's read it again. Look at it in your bulletin. Beyond all question, the mystery from which true godliness springs is great. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by the angels, was preached among the nations, was believed in the world, was taken up in glory. 6 simple phrases. And Paul argues that everything springs up out of that. 6 simple phrases. See, this reminds us that the core of all theology is quite simple. It's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if this phrasing, those 6 things that I just read, if that sounds kind of familiar, it should be. It's one of the earliest forms of a creed, like we read in our spiritual exercises, like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. 6 simple theological statements, all centered around Jesus. See, by centering on this simple set of Christ-centered truths, we prevent theology from becoming unnecessarily complicated by divisive or complex ideas. It keeps our focus on what is essential for faith and godliness. See, this simplicity is wonderful. Not only does it safeguard us from theological overemphasis, but it also reminds us that the gospel's power is found in clarity and is accessible to all. You don't need a master's of divinity to understand God. Now, as we close, let's remember that theology is not just about knowledge or debate. It's about living our faith with purpose, clarity, and love. It grounds us in the truth about God, ourselves, and reality. And it guides us to honor God and love others. See, finding balance is essential. If you tend to dismiss or ignore theology, invest time in reading Scripture. Read some accessible theology books. Listen to a theology podcast. And it helps broaden your understanding of God. See, shallow theology leads to a shallow faith. But deep theology protects us from lies, and it guides us into more godly living. Now, on the other hand, if you tend to focus too much on theology, remember, its true purpose is transformation, not just knowledge. Embrace the mystery of Christ. Not everything needs to be neatly organized, defined, and categorized. Together, let's see theology as a tool. Our knowledge of God should fuel our love for Him. Our knowledge of God should fuel our love for Him. It should fuel our love for others. It should lead us into transformation. That's why we've included it in our new mission statement. We are a next-gen Hmong church experiencing God together. Experiencing God without sound theology can lead to a shallow faith, while sound theology without experience can lead to lifeless knowledge. Now, which area do you need to develop? Which do you need to lean into, grow stronger in? The experiential or the theological? Because when you do that, you can help carry RiverLife into the next decade. You can help pass on our faith to the next generation. Join me in prayer.